Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And tonight I'm here in New York at the Washington Square Hotel. And so we're going to continue our weekly series of talks and lectures. And this evening, we're very happy to have Amelia Jones. Hello, Amelia. How are you?
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Where are we finding you this evening?
I am in my USC office in Los Angeles.
Great. Well, it's nice to be able to spend some time with you and talk about Queer Communion and the exhibition, which was at the ICA in Los Angeles and also at Participant Inc. in New York. And so you're back at school teaching, yes?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And how's it going?
Great.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful being back in the classroom.
Good. Good. I want everyone to say hello to my colleague, Paula Sierra. Paula is back there. I think, hello, Paula. Nice to see you.
Hi,
Hunter. Hi, Paula. And Paula will be here trying to help us to figure out any technical questions that we have. But just to tell you a little bit about the Stonewall National Museum and Archive, we're located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We are one of about 50 gay archives in the United States. There's actually a great one at USC. The one archive is there. And we're probably about the second or third largest LGBTQ archive. In our library, we have 28,000 volumes, and you can actually go through the card catalog and see the books that are there through our website at stonewall-museum.org. And then in addition, in our archive, we have 2,700 linear feet of gay history going back from 1950 to the present day. Papers, serials, organizing documents, a lot of it dealing with the different political fights in South Florida, particularly in Miami-Dade, Broward County, also a lot of information with regard to the Anita Bryant years in the late 1970s, as well as everything that's happened since that time. The archive has about 1,500 different serials from all over the United States, large and small, all of the national ones, as well as many local and regional ones. We just received a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which is allowing us to digitize a lot of what's in the archive. And so we'll be working on that starting this fall and well into next year. In addition to the library and the archive, we also do exhibitions. And right now we have 2 exhibitions up. And again, the exhibitions are drawn almost exclusively from the archives. One is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which looks at the 225-year relationship between the U.S. military and the LGBTQ community, starting with George Washington and the lieutenant who was arrested and jailed for sodomy, one of his top lieutenants, and then going all the way to today, in which we have a no ban whatsoever on LGBTQ members serving in the military. Additionally, in the Ross Gallery is an exhibition called Off Our Backs, which is looking at early lesbian publications from 1956 to 2000. And that show will be coming down in the next week or two. And that will be replaced by a show called Misinformation, which is looking at the very early days of the AIDS crisis and all of the different theories and misinformation that was coming out through the general press as well as the gay press. And there's so many similarities as to what was happening at that time as to what's happening now in the COVID situation. So we hope to have that show up probably in about 2 weeks. We want to thank our friends at the Our Fund Foundation. They provide support for all of these talks. They provide closed captioning as well as translation and a stipend for our participants. So thank you to everybody at Our Fund. If you don't get our newsletter, you can go to stonewall-museum.org. You can sign up there. Those go out every Tuesday, and so you can stay aware of what's going on. We want to say hello to our friends on Facebook. We know many people get their talks there, and so it's nice to see all of you. And if you know anybody who's interested, of course, this talk will be recorded or is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website in about 72 hours, and so people will be able to see it there. So I think that's all of the business I have here. And so, Amelia, let's just put a little context around your background here. You're presently teaching at USC and Vice Dean for Academics and Research at the Roski School of Art and Design. And of course, recent publications certainly include Queer Communion about Ron Athey's, which you co-edited with Andy Campbell. And then, and this was a best art book, or what was one of the best art books in the New York Times in 2020. And your next book out is called In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, will be published. Has it been published yet, or is it still due out this year?
Yeah, it's already out.
Is it?
Yeah.
Great. Good. We certainly want to get a copy of that as well, too. So tell us a little bit about, well, let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved with Ron Athey's work?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of this little slideshow I do. Would you like me to just jump in and then I can address that as I go through?
Sounds good.
Great. Yeah, so Queer Communion, Queer Performance, it is, the show comes out of a long, history of interests, which of course partly start with my friendship with Ron Acy. So I'll get to that in a minute, but I start by kind of saying, how do we think about queer archives, in this case, specifically queer performance, and how do we curate them into a gallery situation or museum, which is not really intended for performance. So I make a case that the show really is not an exhibition of performance art per se, because you can't exhibit performance art. Performance art is something that is done or is an action. So rather it's an exhibition of a performance, creative life and career that is structured around the question of community. And so I can talk more about that too. In curating a show then of kind of a specific life of performance that is queer, the question is how to keep the work alive, how to give people a sense of the dynamism and energy of the work, but also of the career, how to convey a historical framework, to tell a story that provides the work with texture and gives people, especially younger people who don't necessarily know the history of, for example, the culture wars or the AIDS crisis, to give them a sense of that while, again, kind of foregrounding the energy of the work and the career. And then also as a curator, you have to think about the aesthetic experience of the exhibition itself. So you don't want people to walk in and feel bored or overwhelmed. You don't want to have just like a wall of vitrines with paper or too much video, too much of one thing or another. So all of those things were in the foreground as I thought about how to do this. Lots of questions about what it means to talk about a show of queer performance art. What do we mean by queer? Do we mean that the show itself is queer, that the work is queer, that the artist associated with it is LGBTQ identified? So that's a whole also group of questions that I can talk about. So yeah, why was I drawn to Ron's work? And this goes to your first question. I initially met Ron Acy when I was living in Los Angeles, the first time I was living here, which was between 1987 and 2003. And in the early 90s, I got to know started to be really interested in performance art. As someone trained as an art historian, there really wasn't any performance or body art that was allowed into discourses of art history. So because I'm the kind of perverse person who's always looking at the thing you're not supposed to be doing, I was immediately, on emerging from graduate school, kind of drawn to that. And I met Bob Flanagan and Sherry Rose, who were just emerging out of the BDSM club scene into the more kind of performance art venues, such as Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions and Highways. So they said, you've got to come and see this guy. He's a really good friend of ours. His name is Ron Acy. And that was the Deliverance performance that on the left, you see a flyer for that, which I came across in the archive. And there's that wonderful moment where you're like, oh my God, I actually went to that show. And so I include that in the exhibition as a kind of personal touchstone when I first saw Ron perform. And the story that I tell about this is that the work, when I saw this performance, and this was Deliverance is part of his torture trilogy works that he produced in the 1990s, which were related to the culture wars and called out by Jesse Helms. But the way that I tell this story personally is that when I saw Deliverance, I was really awed and amazed, but it really was the kind of performance work I wasn't able to really accommodate emotionally at the time. And I like to tell the story this way because it is really important that any kind of cultural product, but possibly especially performance, because it can be so intense, is not necessarily something that everyone will immediately enjoy and, you know, will be part of their cultural appreciation. So it really took me, and I did see, you know, I would run into Ron at events and so on, but it wasn't until I moved to the UK in 2003 with 2 young children and was abandoned, and my whole personal life fell apart, and I was a single parent, and the world was like too much for me to bear. And then I went to see this epic debut performance of Judas Cradle in 2004 in Ljubljana, and I immediately, the work just completely spoke to me. Mm. And so I think it's important that often you're not in the right kind of personal space for this, especially this kind of extreme work. And it just didn't even make sense to me really until I basically felt eviscerated. And so seeing Ron impale himself on this Judas Cradle just made perfect sense to me. And I wrote a piece about that experience of kind of like suddenly connecting to this particular form of extreme, intense, aesthetically very highly charged experience. And I wrote an article in TDR about that kind of sudden moment of understanding, as it were. And so that started at the same time in the UK. There was a lot of interest in the question of performance and performance documentation. And so it started percolating that maybe this would be like really challenging and interesting to try to, you know, what would it mean to try to curate a show of this particular kind of performance? Because Ron really is a consummate performance artist. He does not make objects. The things that he produces with his hands are usually sketches or, you know, very preliminary ideas that work their way into what are very theatrical performances.
And just as an aside here too, people should know that in the catalog, you do publish a fair number of his sketches, which actually does give a nice view inside some of his thinking as he was preparing for some of these performances.
Yeah, exactly. And I even have some of those images further along. So there's a section of the catalog that's actually in a different paper stock, which is Ron's writings. And some of them have been previously published, and they're kind of classics, like his cover story for the LA Weekly, which is was our alternative paper, like the Village Voice, on Miss Velma, the charismatic preacher. And then some of them are completely unpublished, doodles, sketches, diary entries, really raw material. So I definitely wanted to include some of that in the show. And then the catalog's kind of a special place to explore the nature of this kind of career in a different way from the show. So you don't have to be experientially exciting because it's a book. So it's a whole different way of presenting the archive. So the catalog is a kind of functions as a pendant or a companion to a much more art historical book by Dominic Johnson called Pleading in the Blood, about Ron's career. And that book does the kind of art historical taxonomical work that Dominic does really well. And so that freed us, when Andy Campbell and I were planning the catalog, from feeling like we needed to do that, and we could do a much scrappier, kind of more, more archival book. So that was really exciting and fun. Not just obviously curating the show was one thing, but the catalog, we really had a good time kind of exploring what can you do in this format.
And again, just to give people context about the show as well, too, I think it started at Participant Inc. in New York, and then ended up at ICA in Los Angeles. And it's just closing, I think, today, September, where are we, September 5th or 6th or 7th in 2021.
Yeah, so it just closed in Los Angeles. It was at the ICA LA. And so the other question about the curatorial premise is, why, like, the normal one-person artist show would be the artist's name and then maybe a subtitle. And I actually even had to argue with the venues about putting Queer Communion first before Ron's name. And it was important to me because I knew the show would be about Ron. I mean, it's inescapable. He's the figure around whom it all revolves, and he's the person who inspired even my concept of queer communion. But I wanted to foreground the community, and also the communion is meant to reference the religious aspect. Ron was born and raised into a Pentecostal fundamentalist Christian family, also extremely dysfunctional. And so that charismatic preacher aspect of his childhood, which he brings into the work, he brings that energy into the work, was important. So once I started thinking about community, I decided to organize the show around different communities that Ron had helped to form or circulated within. And so the show, and to some degree the catalog, but especially the show, is organized conceptually through these communities. And so it's kind of recursively chronological in that it starts with the concept of family and religion. But then that section also includes a much more recent piece that's about his family. So it's not a strict chronology at all. And you kind of, as you walk around the show, you immerse yourself in these communities and Ron, try to understand Ron's role within them. So that's kind of the overarching idea. And you can see that, perhaps reciprocally in relation to the show that Ron knew we were opening, he says very recently to Hans Ulrich Obrist, we were doing our thing and creating a bit of family around this kind of gender queer experimentation. Wouldn't it be better to help develop a scene you'd want to live in or you'd want to learn from? I mean, this is really it's just one way of looking at his life and career. It really is a really, I think, exciting and dramatic way to understand the work.
And of course, it's even outside of the art world, it's a path that many LGBTQ individuals take, in the sense that the family
Absolutely.
that they have developed themselves may have nothing to do with their biological family, and so it's a path that many individuals go down.
Absolutely. So chosen community is a key kind of lens through which you experience the work. And sometimes the community are collaborators in the performances. Sometimes they're the audience. Sometimes, well, usually it's both of those things. And you'll see throughout the show and the catalog, the same community, you know, appearing and reappearing, and so that there's a loyalty, there's a generosity, and that is, I think, exemplary of queer community, that it is kind of finding your chosen family and creating or expanding on these spaces where you can solidify that community, but also explore aspects of queer desire, queer living, queer community forming in ways that normative culture would not, probably would not sanction. So that's a big part of it. And as I said, well, this was at participant in the moment where I arrived, you know, during COVID times, and everybody was all nervous about flying. So this was February, and it gives you a sense of the joy and chaos. Ron had arrived the day before and had brought all these bags of extra props. And I found my controlling art historical self kind of prickling. I'm like, but this is a curated show. You can't just bring all these things. And what are you doing? And which was true, but it was also true that I needed to challenge my kind of controlling mechanisms and understand that for Ron, this is like his life, right? Like this is his lived experience. So it made sense once I started to think about it, that when we were installing the costumes, for example, he really wanted to bring them to life through these kind of cast body parts, which if you see like the dress that's being hung on the wall there, they're gold hands that are cast from Ron's body. And the art historian in me was like, but you can't do that because this costume actually wasn't worn by Ron. So it bothered me that his hands were on it, but then, you know, it looked great. So I gave in. And so there's some inaccuracies in the installation, but it definitely made it a lot more dynamic and beautiful. And then, you know, even installing the show became its own form of queer community. So especially because it was extremely cold out and it was COVID times. So, you know, you weren't going to go hang out outside or in a restaurant, because it was only almost the day that the show opened when restaurants opened again in New York. So, you know, it was a really interesting time to be installing a show. And then the day of the opening, because of COVID, it was all day long. And, you know, you had to have an appointment. So it was a very different way to experience an opening, but it did feel like queer community. So there we were, you know, waiting all day, and Kimbra Fowler would come in with her makeup and her, so it really felt like a celebration.
And how was the reception in New York?
Oh, it was great. You know, we got some amazing reviews, some very thoughtful reviews, and it felt like a lot of, you know, a lot of people were coming. And the wonderful thing about this show is a lot of the people who come are not conventional art world visitors, right? I mean, you know, even Kimbra Fowler is a kind of alternative artist who does her own form of performance. So, but then there were some art world people like Stuart Comer and the people you kind of hope to give it a look also coming. And so you do the thing with the, you know, the social media posts, and And you can see that the way that those costumes are displayed, really Ron and his collaborators deserve a lot of credit for that drama.
Now, on this piece, there is a very special cape behind in the background there, the brown one. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, that is Lee Bowery's cape, which Nicola Bowery gave to Ron just after Lee Bowery had passed away. And Ron has used it in various performances, such as Judas Cradle. So yeah, it even just that cape holds this kind of legacy of queer community and these alliances across generations and across different parts of the world. It also speaks to the immense losses within the queer, especially the queer urban communities because of the AIDS crisis.
And Lee Bowery, just for people who might not be aware, I would say passed away maybe 7 or 8 years ago, was definitely very part of the club scene here in New York for decades, and well respected in a variety of different ways. And there's a great essay in your catalog about that particular piece.
Yeah, so that's the part of the catalog where we decided to have this section called Object Lessons, and we commissioned particular scholars, in this case Alpesh Patel, to write about specific objects in the archive. And we had a lot of fun, and the people writing the essays had a lot of fun, I think, with just like thinking about that one thing and what it's like to hold it, or what it's like to wear it on your body, what it's like to encounter it in the museum space. In this case, this cape is extremely heavy, which you may not be able to tell from the image. And so Ron had these great stories of, like, you know, wearing it for a performance in which he's grandly walking backwards and has to like kick this extremely heavy velvet out of his way so he doesn't trip and destroy the whole kind of mood of the piece. So, you know, those are the like actualities of what these they are archival in a way, or they may become archival, but they're still lived pieces. They're still, Ron was actually borrowing objects from the ICA show to go do a performance at Red Cat here. So they're all still potentially wearable, performable things.
And that's great. It's great to hear that he was actually able to take things out of the exhibition and still continue to make his work, which, I mean, a major part of the work, of course, is the live performance, as you said in the beginning of this talk. And so it's nice. I mean, you know, in some circles, we wouldn't even think of an artist taking things off the wall of an exhibition and putting them into something else. But it's wonderful that that happens. You've mentioned the archive a few times, and of course, that's wonderful for us to hear. And I believe that some of Ron's pieces are at the Getty. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is the perfect moment to show this image, which is, so Ron's archive is really just his stuff. So it's worth reminding people that an archive is just, you know, a person's stuff that gets collected and organized into a logic in an institution. And this shows you not long ago, 5 years ago, when Ron moved back to Los Angeles into this rent control apartment that he'd had for many, many years, for 25 years. So even when he lived briefly in London, he sublet it so he could return to it. And as he describes it, you know, back in the day, it was very inexpensive to live in LA. So he had this incredibly nice 2-bedroom apartment, and there was a garage where he could just put, you know, every time he did a performance, he would just put all the stuff in the garage. So you actually see the Judas Cradle here on its side, you know, and it's got a bunch of other costumes kind of stuffed inside of it. And so one of the things that I address in relation to the show, and I even had an event here called Queer Survivance, was about this precarity that a lot of queer people face, especially queer creative people who aren't working in mainstream industries. You know, they don't have a lot of money, and Ron doesn't have a lot of money. So when this rent control apartment situation came to an end, he started posting on Facebook that he was going to throw his archive in the street and burn it all because he was so angry. And so my partner and I brought a truck over, and basically one trip after another brought everything into our garage and my closet in my office at home. We do not have a huge house or a huge garage, and the garage is actually my partner's studio. So he's a bit grumpy about having all this Ron Acy stuff, including the Judas Cradle, which was there until the show. And that's the reality, is like, there's, you know, people like Ron don't have a lot of resources to put things in proper storage. So as this was happening, I was also helping contact potential archives to acquire all this material. And long story short, we made arrangements, thanks to Glenn Phillips and John Tain, who were at the Getty, for the Getty to acquire the archive, but they're only interested in the paper archive. So none of the costumes are going to the Getty, which I think is really sad, because when you separate those two things, you really lose the wondrous connectedness you get walking around the show when you're seeing both the paper archive and the costumes. And so then there became a moment where the Getty was going to come and pick up this archive, and I had to frantically, I had like 6 weeks, basically in the fall of 2017, to curate the show before I even had secure venues. So I had to pull out everything I thought might be in the show, because once the Getty acquires the materials, they don't loan it out again. So they will loan out 1 or 2 things at a time, but never on the scale. So this show was really the last opportunity to do a large scale show of Ron's work.
But what an amazing story about the idea, not so much about the Getty, but just between, you know, a queer artist and a queer community sort of bumping up against institutional rules out there that, you know, that exist, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive, and to have to make that decision about what you thought you were going to need for the show and still be committed to it, and to make it happen, as you say, without even a venue in place. That's quite a ride.
Yeah, it is. And it raises the point that, you know, the catalog was, there's the Dominic Johnson book I was mentioning. The catalog was for me super easy. I mean, easy, it was a lot of hard work, but I had no problem finding a publisher to do the catalog, partly because I wanted it to be a kind of companion. And so I went to the same press and I said, would you be interested in doing another Ron Acy book that you could design to look like a companion, but that would be doing something very different? And Intellect Press is the best. I mean, they're just amazing. And they said, absolutely. And, you know, we have, as you know, because you've seen the catalog, it's hundreds of images. I mean, basically, they just let us do exactly what we wanted to do. But getting venues was really, really difficult. So, you know, that says something, that's a complicated thing. It's partly that, you know, museums don't really see themselves as spaces for performance art or even for a performance career, but also, honestly, the intensity and BDSM extremity of Ron's work is really frightening for most art venues, just to be blunt. So it is partly that it's very queer work. It's very intense, openly erotic, sexual work. And most galleries, you know, are quite concerned about, so they'll it's easier to get one of Ron's performances mounted somewhere than it is to get a show like this, because the show, if you think about it, is there for a long period of time. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety around the potential for some kind of public upset around the imagery. And of course, that's also partly because Ron was targeted in the culture wars in the early to mid 90s. So there was a lot of anxiety around showing the work.
But thankfully, we have proprietors like Leah at Participant Inc. who are willing to put this work up and bring this work to the public. You mentioned something about the BDSM part, and of course, anybody who knows Ron's work knows that that's part of it. And then also there is a fair amount having to deal with piercings, bleeding, body modifications. He himself is heavily tattooed. Some people may be familiar with Kathy Opie's images of him, but talk a little bit about the role that BDSM and the human body plays in his work.
Yeah, sure. You know, I mean, you have to go back to kind of the religion part. So maybe I'll, you know, these are the sections of the show, and these give you the two installation shots. On the left is participant, and on the right is ICALA. And from afar, it can look fairly anodyne and safe, but the minute you walk in both cases, you're confronted by this piece that you see in the participant image on the left. So it's 3 video monitors, and then on the floor is a 4th monitor. And that piece is called Joyce. You see it at the bottom right here. And it is in some ways the most disturbing of all the works in terms of BDSM. And so it connects Ron's highly dysfunctional childhood, where his female relatives were sexually abusing his sister, and he kind of stages and narrates this in this piece. So there's some very graphic images of an actor playing Ron who is cutting himself. There are images of a woman fist fucking another woman. It's like really intense. And part of that, you know, I put the piece there intentionally because you kind of have to go there if you want to understand the whole career, because he's coming out of this extremely hypocritical childhood where he's being groomed as a minister while he's living with this sexual abuse. Same people, you know, on both sides. So that, it's not a pat way of explaining Ron's interest in BDSM, but it's one way of understanding and gaining access to it, especially for people who don't circulate in that community. So yeah, it's important to understand that for Ron, you know, it's all part of a continuum of emotional intensity, which for him as a child was in the same house, you know, so so when he then goes into the club scene, he leaves home as a teenager and again finds these spaces where he's allowed to kind of explore this violence in a more constructive way. And again, that sounds a little pat, but it is, if you look at him as a teenager, you see in these 2 blown up photographs, he's going into these club situations or punk music situations. He is not a musician, so he's not performing the music, but he is performing kind of vignettes that are part of the sensibility of the music. And this is part of a whole scene in Los Angeles around 1980 where you have people like Johanna Wendt who are doing these extreme performances that are very punk, but also involve costumes and vocalizations. And so that's kind of where he's coming into the scene. And then on the right side, you see him really almost 10 years later. So there's a bit of a hiatus in the 80s where he succumbs to drug abuse and then goes into recovery programs, and also finds out he's HIV positive in 1986. And there are some of the writings in the catalog where he's writing during that period and kind of trying to figure out how to live a life, and what's going to happen to him. And of course, all the fear connected to finding out you're HIV positive. And then around 1990, he starts to go to these queer clubs in Los Angeles. And so suddenly you have this like totally exuberant, sexy kind of go-go dancing. And then that really segues into strictly BDSM, where he's learning, you know, the very careful strategies that people use in that community to cut and pierce safely, and that gets worked into the subsequent performances.
And of course, that's there's a fisting image that Kathy Opie has made, which of course a lot of people are very familiar with that. And looking at this one image you have here on the screen, the one on the right, I see him gyrating there and with the codpiece. And you wrote one of the essay, you wrote several pieces in the catalog, but there's an essay that you wrote about the codpiece. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's the object lesson section of the catalog, where I chose to write about this fabulous leather codpiece. There are actually several different versions of it. You might remember the picture of Ron in his garage holding up one of the versions that where the studs had corroded, and so the leather's like green. But I just like, for me, that object just kind of, which is kind of still crusty with sweat, and, you know, it just sums up the erotic energy and exuberance of this celebration that Ron would create in these queer clubs, you know, just through the sheer exuberance of dancing and sweating with other queer people as a way of really refusing the negativity and fear that the AIDS crisis was naturally causing among the community.
The last paragraph, I just happened to mark it here, of your essay. Death lurks behind and within Ron's body, objects, just as it haunts mine and yours. The codpiece, with its residue of sloughed off dead cells and proteins, is the death of art itself. That's pretty profound.
Yeah, I guess I got a little grandiose with that. I mean, but Ron's work kind of you know, it's kind of asking you to do that almost, because. Yeah.
Well, but again, I mean, I've never seen one of his performances, but in reading what you put together and hearing you speak about it, it's the role that the human body, that he uses the human body, in most cases his, and certainly other performance artists have certainly done this as well too, but it impacts everybody. It impacts many people who actually see it, let me put it that way. And I think also what's interesting too is it is to some degree, whether gay or straight, why some people are attracted to a lot of the imagery associated with the queer community in general, because it is so tactile in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, like I said, going back to my experience of suddenly having Judas Cradle make total sense. You know, I'm not HIV positive. I am a queer ally, but I have a nominally masculine love object, although he's pretty queer. And so, yeah, you don't have to be an LGBTQ person in terms of, you know, the object of your attraction. You can be someone who opens yourself to this kind of honesty about the limits of the body. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say in my interpretation of the cod pieces. Yeah, you can be in denial and say, oh no, this is awful and bodies should never be cut or pierced or impaled. But first of all, the history of Western art is filled with images of impaled bodies, usually those of saints or Christ himself.
I was going to say all the religious ones. There's hardly one without a drop of blood in it, or some.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, of course, the gay men have often been fascinated with the Sebastian image, which Ron, worked into some of the torture trilogy pieces. So, yeah, I mean, the imagery is there in our culture, and we tend to kind of sanitize it when we think about it or talk about it, but it's there. And one of the, I'm not a Catholic, I was not raised Catholic, but the one thing you can say about Catholicism is at least they were putting it out there, whereas Protestants tend to be very repressive when it comes to the suffering body. And one of the ways to experience Ron's work, or even just the career, if you're looking at the show, is by giving yourself permission to have the feelings that it might be allowing you.
Man, I think that's really a key point here, and I think what's really nice about what you've done, what both you and Andy have, and all the work that you've done on the exhibition, is really you do sort of invite people through Ron's work and give them permission to see what they're willing to see and how they want to see it. And so that brings me to a point which you touched on a little bit, but I'd like to go back and look at it a little bit, which is a little bit more, which is the societal response to Ron's work. And I think you've talked about, and we've heard about the idea about how difficult it is to bring some of this work in museums and into commercial galleries or nonprofit galleries. People do get worried about, well, how is attendance going to be, and how it's going to affect their bottom line and all those things, and will society look like it? But I think the other thing I want to touch on, because I do think it's relevant today, is what happened in the culture wars of the late 1980s and early 1982, and with the whole issue with Jesse Helms and the NEA. And some people, of course, are very familiar with that, but ultimately he was swept up into all that drama. And if I'm correct, he never received an NEA grant.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I can move to that. We're still in the early days here. Literature, tattoo. Then we move into the culture wars and where he starts making explicit performance art. So let me see if there's a better image. So you see here the vitrine. This is at Participant, and it's got press from the culture war moment where Ron was sucked into it. So the way that he got sucked into it is typical, right? Because none of these people ever actually see the thing that they're demonizing. And it's the same today with critical race theory. They're doing the exact same thing. None of them have read it. They don't know what it is, but they know they can use it to garner their base. So I think it's actually really important moment to study this history, because we're seeing a very similar thing happen.
No, but keep it going. But I do want to just interject one thing. We all saw that article in the New Yorker last week talking about how eBay has really cracked down on anything having to do with sex, and even specifically talking about Honcho, which of course is one of the pieces, one of the magazines that carried Ron's work. And so we really are in that same moment today.
Yeah, for sure. And there's actually a Honcho, one of his columns is displayed in that tattoo BDSM section. So I'm actually originally from North Carolina, so I've had a vendetta against Jesse Helms since I was a kid. And so I used my curatorial power to put him on the smallest possible screen. So there he is in his screed against Ron. And he has to face There he is. And then on the other side of the room, this is in participant, he's facing the monitor showing the footage of the performance that he never saw.
Good for you.
Demonizes. So I'm like, I know I'm going to make Jesse deal with this. So the performance that he never saw, that he nonetheless brings up on the floor of Congress to demonize Ron, is 4 Scenes in a Harsh Life, which was performed at Patrick's Cabaret in Minneapolis, which was, you know, more or less a queer club. And the Walker Art Gallery co-sponsored that piece with $150 from their, you know, general, well, with some money from their general funds, of which $150 were determined to have come from the NEA. So nothing ever went to Ron directly. Only $150 had something to do with this particular, you know, but basically was being paid to Patrick's Cabaret, not to Ron. So classic example of like pretty attenuated connection actually to taxpayer dollars. But yeah, this is partly why venues are nervous about showing Ron's work, although I'm happy to say that I should get the data, but I'm quite certain that the participant show did very well, especially considering it was mostly during the COVID shutdown. And the ICA show, I'm pretty sure would have been up there in terms of breaking records for attendance. So the beauty is, if you do this right, you know, you can bring in some of the art world, but also there's a huge queer community across places like California, you know, who will actually come to see a show like this because it's their community and it's their world. So you bring in a pretty big audience actually, and one that might expand ICA moving forward. I'll just say one more thing about venues. I mean, it's true that I was not going to go to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art with this proposal. So there are certain museums that are seen as family museums that get a lot of public funding, or at least some public funding, where there's no point in pushing that boundary. So neither I nor Ron are remotely interested in repositioning him as this kind of shock artist. That's never been what he wanted to do. And it actually would be counterproductive to put this in a space where that would be a response to it. So the venues ended up being the ones that habitually have taken risks. Leah Ganjitano, whom you mentioned, a participant, I don't think any of this would have happened without her. I mean, she really, from the minute I presented it to her maybe 4 years ago, she was 100% behind it. And you really have to have that kind of support to do something where, like, I have no money, like I was not being paid, I was just kind of doing this. And Leah just made it happen, you know, by getting grants and making sure that it happened. And then thankfully, Jamila James, who's also committed to doing complicated queer shows. She had just done the Nayland Blake show. And so she committed to doing it at the ICA. And I'm super grateful, because it would have been awful if this show never came to LA, because this is really where Ron is from.
Yeah, no, that all makes total sense. We are getting close to the end here, but I know we jumped over a bunch of slides that you organized. And if there's like one category that you would like to pick out here, and just to be able to go back through, because the slides are so helpful. I have to say, I've not seen these, and I know both of those spaces. And so it's really nice to be able to see them.
I mean, I guess I would end by, maybe this is a good place to end, which is the last section of the show is new work and community. And the participant version of the show, Leah had actually cleared out what used to be her office. So thank God we got that additional backspace. But it's a very small space. So there was only a few things we could include back there. And what you're seeing is the Louis XVI wig from Acephalous Monster, which is the very new piece that Ron just reperformed at the Red Cat here. And then the beaded curtain, which we lit with this kind of lurid red light, is something that appears throughout a number of different performances. And then the penis poles, as I call them, which play a role in Acephalous Monster and the Minotaur mask. And then you see in a detail on the right, the slideshow of hundreds of pictures of Ron and his friends from the archive. And so this is kind of interesting in terms of how do you document history? How do you document performance history? Tons and tons of photographs, hard copy photographs in the archives up until the early 2000s, and then there are zero. So we all need to think about the implications of the fact that we don't even print out photographs anymore. We view them on screens. So I would say half of these images are scanned from hard copies in the archive. The other half are dragged off of Ron's social media, where he's constantly posting pictures. And there, a few of them actually are photographs that I've taken over the last 10 years as I've kind of followed Ron around various performances. So this shows you the ICA version had a lot more room, but much less mood, because they would only paint one wall black. It was very important to me at least to have that one wall so that we moved away from the white cube feeling a little bit. That, you know, you see some of the same pieces and then some additional items we were able to fit in at ICA, including this vitrine on the right, which has various hilarious and fun items from Ron's archive of things that his friends have sent him. So you look on the left, those are actually 2 Sebastian postcards that friends sent him. And it includes a facsimile of the back so you can see what the friends wrote. And there's an object on the right made by Kathy Opie and some little things from Annie Sprinkle, etc. And I was also able to include these stunning 4 portraits of Ron. These are not strictly from the archive. Although 2 of them are owned by Ron, but they're just pieces that I know because actually the painting is something I bought myself from Lisa Teasley, who's one of Ron's friends. She painted this beautiful portrait. So it was just an interesting way to kind of sum up the show. So as you're coming to the end of it, this is there.
And of course, it allows other voices. I mean, to have Paul Sapaya in there as well, too, is sort of very nice as far as younger up-and-coming artists here as well. Well, we only have a moment or 2 left here. And so let me go back to one of the things you started out with in the very beginning was the idea about, is the work queer? Is the artist queer? Is the topic queer? You know, it's a very big topic. And it's one I think that a lot of people wrestle with. But can you give me, you know, this is not necessarily about Ron now per se, but really about the whole genre of gay art and queer art and what's going on out there. And I very much look forward to seeing your next book, which you say just came out. But if you can summarize sort of how you feel about queerness in the art world right now and how that is coming out, and to answer that question, what makes it queer? What makes it gay? Is it all the above or none of the above or something between?
Well, I don't think there's an answer, and I'm certainly not the one to provide it. But I think it's a constant debate and dialogue. You know, so Jonathan Katz is someone who's curated a number of LGBTQ shows, which generally are based on the premise that the artist we identify in some way as having same-sex object choice and, you know, would be identified as lesbian or gay. You know, so there are different ways of thinking about it. I think one of the things I was trying to do was create an experience of Ron's career that itself was not overly fixed or authoritative, which to my mind would not pay homage to queerness. Like there's a certain argument that queerness is about leaving things open and understanding things as networked, or as Jose Munoz would say, it's something that you do queer. It's not something that resides somewhere or that we can fix on. So even in that slideshow, you know, if that or this array of portraits is the last thing you experience in the show, you're going to see the way that Ron continues to create community across generations, across, you know, race and class, and, you know, and that to me is, again, I'm engaging it as queer, and I'm hoping that it will feel queer, whether or not the visitor to the show is themselves identified as queer or not. So, you know, you have to think about all kinds of visitors and hope that everyone gets something out of it that's productive.
Great. Well, Amelia Jones, thank you so much for your time. This has been just a fascinating conversation. Thank you for all the work that you've done on this exhibition, as well as catalog, and really taking the time to walk us all through it. So it was great to connect with you this way. And again, you're just very generous with your time and your resource. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, happy to see you. I want to say good night to my colleague, Paula Sierra, back there. Paula, thank you very much. Nice to see you. And for those of you who are in South Florida, please feel free to come by to the Stonewall National Museum and Archives. You can find us at stonewall-museum.org. And this talk was being recorded, and we will have it up in the next couple of days, and we certainly will put it on Ron's Facebook page as well too, since I know that he is out there on Facebook. So good night, everybody. Thank you.